I'm not a doctor, but I'm a nurse. I work with geriatric patients, and there was this incident about 3 years ago. Before I explain, let me say that I don't believe in ghosts. Anyway, this one time I was working the night shift and I was super sleepy, so I decided to skip lunch because I wasn't hungry and go to my car and sleep for 30 minutes. I got inside my car, covered myself with my sweater, set the timer on my phone, and immediately knocked out. I'm dreaming, but in my dream I'm still awake, just sitting there. Someone taps on my car window and I see that it's one of my patients. We'll call her Dee. Surprised, I ask Dee what the hell she's doing outside, and she tells me she is looking for her daughter. I tell her to go back inside and that we will call her daughter in the morning. My patient becomes angry and starts banging on my car window. I kind of freak out and try to reach for the door handle to get out and calm her down, but I quickly realize I can't move. Let me add that I frequently experience sleep paralysis, so even though I am asleep, I realize what is happening. I fight it and try squirming my body in an attempt to wake myself up. I finally manage to wake up and my heart is racing and my forehead is a bit sweaty. I sit there for about a minute, realize it was all a dream, and roll the window down to cool myself off. My break is over and I clock back in and see that my supervisor and two other nurses are huddled in front of a room. I am still by the station clocking when they see me and call me over. I walk over thinking maybe something was wrong with the ventilator or the patient fell, but my supervisor tells me Dee died while I was on my lunch break. Since most of our patients are DNR, I was not paged. It took a couple of seconds for the message to register and I freaked out internally. I got goosebumps but didn't mention anything to my supervisor about the dream. I don't believe in ghosts or anything like that, and I mostly likely had that dream because she was the last patient I interacted with before my break, so she was still on my mind and I was mentally going over my patients' charts in my head. I used to work as an STNA in a nursing home, worked third shift throughout university. During the night, we turned half the lights off so it was darker for the evening and didn't get a lot of light in the residents' rooms. We had one resident who was younger, 70s, and was mostly in for mental reasons. She had long, dark hair and was very thin. I was sitting at the nurses' station at the top of the hall and heard a call light go off. I stood up, looked down the dark hall, and on all fours, straight out of the ring, this resident was crawling up the hall toward me. The other STNA had forgotten to put the bed rail up, and the resident was very good at climbing out of bed. Needless to say, I needed some new britches and my heart was racing a mile a minute. I work as an ICU nurse. A mid-20s female came in with some serious cardiac abnormalities and then went into respiratory distress. Never had any medical history at all. We had to put her on the ventilator, but she was on just enough sedation to keep her lucid. She could nod, shake her head yes and no appropriately to questions. One night, the patient in the room next to hers died, but the body was still in the room about to be taken to the morgue. The female patient's door was closed with curtains drawn, so she couldn't have seen what was going on next door. When I went in to check on her, she had a look of sheer panic on her face, trembling. I asked her a series of questions to see if she was cold, hot, in pain, etc., and she denied all. I asked her if she saw something. She started to aggressively nod her head, yes. She wasn't on any drugs that would make her hallucinate. I went on to get details on what this thing looked like. After playing 20 questions, I got this. A man, pale white, left arm missing, heavy, bald, standing still behind me. This was the man who had just died next door. I spent the rest of the night consoling her. Last summer, my friends and I wanted new experiences, and in search of this, we went to the outskirts of the city to an abandoned hospital. 8 of us gathered, and on the way to the building I learned from my friend that something strange was happening in this hospital, as if moans were coming from there. Pausing, I changed my mind about going there for a second, but I didn't want to make myself look like a coward and moved on. We were getting closer and closer to the 3-story hospital, and this terrifying sight gave me goosebumps all over my body. When I entered the hospital, I was even more scared, but my boyfriend was with me, with whom I felt more confident. We settled on the 3rd floor because it was brighter than all the other floors. To be brave, we didn't drink much energy drink. Afterwards, my friends and I decided to scare our guys. We went down to the 2nd floor, and right along the corridor we found a room in which we wanted to shout. But as soon as we decided to do this, terrible, strange sounds began to be heard from the ward. Frightened by the bullet, we ran to our people and asked them if it was they who shouted, but they thought that it was us who shouted. After a while, everything calmed down. I didn't want to stay there, but my boyfriend said everything would be okay. We spent the night there. At night, I heard my friend whisper. She asked me to go to the toilet with her. Entering the booth, I saw how the mirror became matte before my eyes, but I didn't attach any importance to it. We began to talk with my friend, and then, out of the blue, the ceiling began to crumble. I ran to wake up the others, and yet I persuaded my boyfriend to leave this terrible place. My best friend went with us, and after that, the remaining 4 people developed illnesses the next day, and 1 disappeared. The police are still looking for him, and they called me in for questioning 7 times. Whenever you admit a patient, you have to inquire about their "do not resuscitate" status in case of a code being called. I had one elderly patient, late 80s, early 90s, who was severely demented and chronically ill, in and out of the hospital every month, barely holding on to life, basically a horrible, miserable quality of life. I asked the patient's family, I think it was a granddaughter who had medical POA, but I'm not sure, it was a while ago, about their DNR status. You don't want to put someone through a brutal resuscitation that may not even work if it isn't something that they would want if they wanted to die naturally. She flat out stated that, "Oh, we want everything done for him because we really need his check." I didn't understand at first, but apparently the family was living off of his Social Security and could not have cared less about his pain and suffering or his wishes. I'm pretty sure it was the creepiest thing I've seen. These people were supposed to be his loved ones taking care of him, and they were using him like an inhuman object. On a medical school rotation in psychiatry, I rotated at a hospital which is essentially a full-time psych ward for folks who have pleaded insanity or ended up in an acute psych hospital and were eventually transferred here because they could not become well enough to get home. The place was actually very nice. It was nothing like you see on TV. It was essentially like a college dorm with 6 or 8 wings total. Each wing had like 16 rooms, and each wing was broken down by gender. Each wing also had a gated outdoor area and a gym area, so the patients had a relatively good life considering. Met many patients with many crazy stories, but one always will stand out. This young guy, about 25 years old, was there. He had had these delusions just after college about some girl he had a crush on from his freshman year of college. She wrote for a popular magazine, and he supposedly had these delusions that she was writing about him to make fun of him. He hunted her down in her hometown, raped her, and tried to kill her, but she escaped. He then pleaded insanity and was placed here. I went up and talked to him as a little third-year med student. I started asking about his delusions and whatnot. It turns out his father was high up in an international corporation and worth millions. The kid, who was hauntingly normal on the surface and incredibly creepy once you started digging, told me that he basically pleaded insanity only because his lawyer said to. He never had delusions, never had hallucinations, nothing. He basically thought the girl was hot in college, drove 400 miles to rape her, then freaked out. But his lawyers advised he plead insanity because as a soft upper-class kid he'd do much better in the psych hospital than in prison. So there he was. Luckily, he'll likely spend longer in there than he would have in prison because, generally, that's how it works. But he seriously creeped me the fuck out. Paramedic checking in. A few years ago, I responded to a call for a pregnant female who shot herself. The 911 caller hung up before any more information could be gathered by dispatch. We arrived to find a girl in her early to mid-20s sitting on the bathroom floor, leaning against the front of the bathtub slumped over. She was obviously pregnant, looked to be third trimester to me. She was unresponsive and barely breathing with a rapid carotid pulse. A small revolver was on the floor next to her. We found a single gunshot wound to the center of her very pregnant abdomen. The patient's mother and 4-year-old son were on scene. The mother told us that the patient invited her over for dinner for some company as she had been fighting with the father of her fetus all day long. The mother stated that in the middle of dinner the patient excused herself from the table to use the bathroom. That's when the mother heard a single gunshot. Anyway, the mother told us that the patient was 23 and was almost full term. I can't remember how many weeks, but it was 34, with her second pregnancy. To make a long story short, we intubate the patient, establish 2 IVs, carry her down from the second floor to the truck, and haul ass to the trauma center. The patient went into cardiac arrest as we were wheeling her into the hospital. CPR was started and an emergency C-section was performed in the ER. Both mom and baby died. The bullet went through the baby and through mom's abdominal aorta. Her belly was full of blood. Fucked up call. Medical student. While on my psych rotation, came across an individual who was a chemistry graduate student. Apparently, he had been taking astronomical amounts of ketamine, and he was just continuously disassociated. For the entire time I was on this portion of the rotation, 3 weeks, I never heard him speak a word. 95% of the time he was wrapped up in his sheets like a mummy, and he would just periodically laugh, a crazy soft chuckle from under his covers if you tried to talk to him. The creepiest laugh I've ever heard. I'll never forget that. I'm not a doctor, but I am in the healthcare field as a dental hygienist. The creepiest, most confusing thing I've seen is as follows. We had a new patient come in for a cleaning. He was around 3-4, and Mom said he had never been to the dentist before. Not uncommon for what I see on a daily basis, so at first I didn't think anything of it. I did his cleaning and then went to take his routine x-rays. This is where the SHT got weird. After looking at the x-rays, I could see that the child had already had a large amount of dental work done. He had around 6 or 7 composite tooth color fillings. When I sat back down at my chair, I asked the parents again if he had ever been to the dentist. They were both adamant that he hadn't, and also said there was no way a relative could have taken him without them knowing. What the fuck? How did this happen? Who took him? Where were the parents? Had they possibly been in jail for a long time and not known he was taken to the dentist by someone else and had work performed? What if this wasn't really their child, and actually some kid they kidnapped? His insurance had no record of him having previous dental work, so that was a dead end too. I think about it often, but know that ultimately, I'll never get an answer. It sucks. Verifying death is always sad, but my friend tells the funniest story about how creepy his first verification of death was. This is not meant to disrespect anyone. Black humor is a huge part of doctors' coping strategies. He was on a night shift a few weeks into his first job as a qualified doctor and got a call from a ward to say a lady had passed away. An expected death. Hence, he hadn't been called about her before. And could he come verify and do the paperwork? It's a busy shift with lots of sick people to see first, so he takes several hours to get there. He goes up and they tell him she's in room 8. The door to room 8 is slightly ajar and the room is dark. Now, she was in a side room, but most patients there were in shared bays of 6 beds, so you get into the habit of not turning lights on. In his nervous haste to make sure it didn't look like he was nervous, he slipped into the room armed only with his little pen torch. The window was slightly open, and, he swears, the blind rattled against the sill as he crept towards the bed, the tiny circle of light from his torch picking out the rumpled white hospital blanket, only a very slim rise showing where she lay as she was a tiny old lady, just skin and bone. Finally, the light plays over her face, and he has to bite back a little scream, nearly dropping the torch. For whatever reason, her pose in death is one of a horrified and horrifying snarl, lips drawn back to bare, likely false, teeth, the whites of her eyes showing in a fixed blind stare, and both hands up close to her face curled into claws, slightly overlong nails shining grimly in the meager torchlight. Now, to verify a death, the doctor has to listen for heart and breath sounds for 2 minutes while feeling for a pulse, check for pupil reactions, and check for no response to pain. He flicked the torch dutifully across her glaring eyes, forcing himself to shuffle close enough to touch. First to check for response to pain and then to settle shaking fingers on her throat, so close to those furiously grinning teeth, to feel for a pulse. To get his stethoscope under the collar of her gown under the blankets, he has to lean in even closer, almost nose to nose with her now, unable to draw his gaze away from hers. And he has to stand like that for 2 minutes, the seconds crawling away as he stares into that screaming face. He says there's no way he would have heard heart or breath sounds even if she had been alive. All he could hear was his own racing heart in his ears and, on a loop in his head, "Please don't let her move. Please don't move. Oh dear God, don't move." As a tech in psych years ago, there was a 7-year-old kid sent to the floor because the mom didn't know what to do with him. Sadly common thing to happen, even if the kids don't have page issues. Anyway, the mom was shaking and crying, and they had to take the kid into another room. She was genuinely afraid of her own son. She had suspected something was wrong when she kept finding mutilated animals in the backyard, but never heard or saw coyotes or anything around. The neighbor's smaller pets started disappearing. The boy had an obsession with knives, hiding them around the house, denying anything when the mom confronted him. Then when the two started getting into arguments, he would get really violent and hit her, push her down and kick her, threaten to kill her. On multiple occasions she woke up in the middle of the night with him standing beside her bed, staring her in the face. She put extra locks on her bedroom door to feel safe while Ahi slept. The last straw was when she lifted up his mattress and found 50-plus knives of all shapes and sizes under there. So she brought him to us. I remember talking to him, treating him like he was just any other kid that came through. He seemed remarkably normal until you spoke directly to him. He had this way of looking right through you, or maybe like he didn't see you at all while you were speaking. He would respond like a robot, like he was just saying words because that's what we wanted to hear. And B would always put on this creepy, dead-looking smile, like all mouth and no eye involvement in the smile, especially when he would get away with something, like taking another kid's markers and they couldn't figure it out. Still gives me chills laying here thinking about him. I had to get up and close my bedroom door. I believe I met a 7-year-old psychopath. We got a call to go out to a scene for an elderly woman with chest pains. Arrive at the house, front doors open. We knock, hear the old woman calling out from the back, "I'm in the back room," in a very monotone and calm voice. My partner and I go to the back of the house looking for this woman, and that's when we smelled it. Nothing prepares you for the smell of rotting corpse. I've smelled it a dozen times, and it never gets any less disturbing. We radio for police and ALS backup as we move through the house. We open the door to the master bedroom, and there is our patient. She is approximately 80, and she is staring at the master bathroom with these cold, dead eyes. She never once looked at us as we approached her and began talking to her. I got to the bedside and got in front of her gaze, and she just looked right through me. I turned around to see what she could possibly be looking at, and there was the source of my smell. A man, about the same age as my patient, is on the floor with very little left of his head still attached to his body. A shotgun lay on the floor next to him, and most of his head was strewn about the walls and bathroom counter. We loaded the woman up in the ambulance, and our police backup pulled up. I don't think that woman blinked once the entire time she was in our care. Totally fucked me up.